Sometimes the truth doesn't come to you in a headline. It arrives in a whisper, buried beneath years of quiet patience. And when a nation chooses to walk away from a deal everyone thought it needed, the world leans in, wondering why. But behind that decision lies more than politics. It's about pride, it's about dignity, and it's about finally understanding the cost of compromise. There are moments in history when words become a currency too cheap to spend, when every statement, every promise, every carefully drafted agreement loses its weight in the echo of empty halls. In those moments, silence does not signal weakness. It becomes the sharpest tool in the arsenal. The decision not to respond, not to rush to defend, not to explain, is a decision steeped in power. It is a kind of stillness that unsettles, because it forces the other side to fill in the blanks, to wrestle with the unanswered questions, to wonder what calculations are taking place in the quiet corners they cannot see. India had sat through enough discussions where the words were polished, but the intentions were not. For years, they listened, they nodded, they played the game of diplomacy, even when the deck was stacked and the dealer knew it. Promises were made across shining tables with the kind of sincerity that could win applause, but the results never matched the speeches. Each time, the negotiation ended with India walking away with less than it deserved, dressed up as a fair trade. And so there came a point when speaking became a burden and silence became a strategy. In that silence, there was no announcement of anger. There was no sudden flare of protest or threat. Instead, there was the deliberate act of stepping back, letting the other side's words hang in the air without confirmation, without acceptance, without rejection, a void that could not be filled by speculation alone. This is what made it more powerful than any declaration, because words can be countered, but silence can only be interpreted, and interpretations breed uncertainty. For America, this silence was unexpected. They were accustomed to pushing, to pulling, to finding a way to get the conversation back on their terms. But when the calls went unanswered, when the urgent invitations to resume dialogue were politely declined, when the meeting room stayed empty, something shifted in the atmosphere. What had once been an ongoing, predictable back and forth became a standstill they couldn't control. And in that standstill, India's position grew stronger. Silence also spoke to the people watching from the sidelines, the other nations, the competitors, the partners, the critics. It said, without saying, that India no longer needed to keep explaining its value, that the weight of its resources, its markets, its innovation, its influence did not need constant reaffirmation from anyone else, that it was prepared to walk away without a backward glance if the deal did not honor its worth. It is in the nature of negotiation to believe that the one speaking has the upper hand, but the truth is more complicated. Speaking too much reveals your thinking. Explaining too much exposes your boundaries. Defending yourself too often turns into an admission that your position needs defense at all. Silence, on the other hand, conceals everything. It forces the other side to wonder whether you have better options waiting just out of sight. It plants the idea that maybe, just maybe, you don't need them as much as they thought you did. For India, this was not a silence of passivity. It was a silence born from preparation. They had studied the terms, the conditions, the trends, the future of their own industries. They had weighed the benefits of the trade deal against the hidden costs that rarely made it into public discussion. They had seen the strings attached, and they had decided that those strings would not be theirs to untangle. And so, when the time came, they said, Nothing. They just walked away. That walk was louder than any speech. It was the kind of move that made even those who disagreed stop for a moment and acknowledge the strength it took. Because walking away means facing the unknown. It means turning down immediate gains for long-term independence. It means risking the comfort of the familiar to stand on the uncertain ground of self-reliance. Most countries talk about sovereignty. Few are willing to act on it when the price tag is high. And so the silence continued, not as a pause, but as a declaration without words. It was a reminder that negotiations are not won only at the table. Sometimes they're won by refusing to sit down at all. And in that refusal, in that measured absence, in that choice not to speak, India sent a message that resounded far beyond the room where the talks had once taken place. It was a message America could not ignore because the quiet said what no speech ever could. Self-respect is not just a personal virtue. It is the cornerstone of a nation's identity. For years, India had navigated the global marketplace with the understanding that diplomacy often meant compromise, and compromise often came at the cost of fairness. The language of international trade is dressed in politeness, but beneath the smiles and handshakes, there's always a balance of power being tested. And the terms repeatedly lean in favor of the stronger player when promises of equality mask a system built to keep one side dependent. The question eventually arises, how much dignity is a nation willing to trade for short-term gain? The turning point came when India began to measure value differently. Economic priorities had always been calculated in numbers: export percentages, GDP growth, import costs, trade deficits. But numbers alone can be misleading if they ignore the deeper cost of dependency. Self-respect forced a new equation into the discussion, one factored in more than just profit margins. It asked whether agreements strengthened the nation's autonomy or chipped away at it. It asked whether India's industries were being positioned for growth or being shaped to serve the needs of others. America, with its established influence, often set the tone in negotiations. But setting the tone is not the same as setting the truth. India began to recognize that accepting every opportunity offered was not a sign of progress. It was a subtle way of binding itself to someone else's strategy. Trade deals that looked lucrative on paper sometimes carried hidden clauses, indirect controls, and long-term limitations. These weren't just economic terms. They were levers of influence. And influence, once given, is hard to take back. Self-respect reframed the conversation. No longer was the question, what can we gain right now? It became, what will this make us in 10 years? This shift in mindset disrupted the rhythm of previous dealings. Where once there had been a rush to secure partnerships to signal growth, there was now a measured patience, a willingness to wait for terms that align with both economic benefit and national dignity. This patience, though frustrating to those accustomed to India's quicker concessions, was not born of indecision. It was born of clarity. For the first time in a long time, the worth of a deal was not measured solely by the goods exchanged, but by the independence it preserved. This meant saying no to certain offers, even when they came wrapped in the language of friendship and cooperation. It meant resisting pressure, even when it came from the most powerful voices in the room. It meant absorbing criticism from those who accused India of being stubborn, protectionist, or overly cautious. For self-respect does not bend to accusations. It measures itself by its own principles, not by someone else's approval. So economic priorities began to reflect this shift. More emphasis was placed on building domestic capacity, investing in local innovation, and diversifying partnerships beyond traditional allies. Where once a heavy reliance on a single trade partner might have been accepted for the sake of stability, it was now seen as a vulnerability to be corrected. India started looking inward to strengthen its own production chains, and outward to explore new markets that did not demand disproportionate concession. This was not isolation, it was recalibration. It was a quiet but firm reminder that trade should be an exchange between equals, not a relationship of dependence disguised as cooperation. And equality in trade, as in life, cannot exist without self-respect. The economic map was redrawn with sovereignty at its center. Every new deal weighed against the question of whether it honored India's standing or undermined it. By redefining priorities through the lens of self-respect, India stepped away from the old belief that growth at any cost was still growth. It chose instead a path where every gain had to pass the test of dignity, where every partnership had to reflect mutual respect, and where no amount of profit could justify a loss of control over its own future. Partnerships in the global arena often arrive wrapped in the warm language of cooperation. Smiles, handshakes, and public statements speak of mutual benefit, shared goals, and a future built together. But beneath that polished surface, there can be layers of intent not easily visible to the untrained eye. Over time, India began to notice the subtle patterns, the recurring moments when partnership felt less like collaboration and more like quiet control. Recognizing manipulation is not about cynicism. It is about seeing clearly what others would prefer remain hidden. The mask of partnership works best when trust is assumed. It thrives when one side is willing to take the other at their word without question. For years, trade deals and agreements were framed as win-win situations. Yet the wins were rarely equal. Promises of open access to markets came with regulations that favored one-size industries. Agreements about resource sharing often left India carrying the heavier obligations, while the other side enjoyed the greater profits. And whenever concerns were raised, they were met with reassurances, delays, or technical explanations designed to defuse the moment without truly addressing the imbalance. America had perfected the art of this diplomacy. Every negotiation was painted as a gesture of friendship, every concession framed as a gift rather than a strategic move. The language was smooth, the tone was respectful, but the outcomes told another story. Tariffs would shift at critical moments, supply chains would tighten without warning, and clauses buried deep in agreements would suddenly be enforced in ways that limited India's options. What looked like cooperation in public was, in reality, a slow tightening of economic leverage behind closed doors. Cooperation in public was, like any other kind of legislative effort, has been underestimated by many. Vice President Lind led a slow tightening of economic leverage behind closed doors, while a leader's plight led her represent a state relation passing. India's recognition of this pattern did not happen overnight. It came from years of watching how temporary measures became permanent disadvantages, how the language of shared responsibility often meant India shouldered the larger risks, and how market access was always more open in one direction than the other. Slowly, the realization took shape. Partnership was being used as a shield for influence. and influence was being used to guide India's decisions in ways that served someone else's strategy more than its own. The shift began with asking different questions. Instead of what are we being offered, the question became, why is this being offered now? Instead of how do we fit into this plan, it became, whose plan is this really? That change in perspective stripped away much of the illusion. Offers that once seemed generous began to look like carefully timed maneuvers. Promises that once felt reassuring began to reveal the leverage they carried. Recognizing manipulation meant facing uncomfortable truths. It meant acknowledging that not all friendly allies act without self-interest, and that even long-standing partners can prioritize their own survival over fairness. It also meant resisting the easy path of accepting deals simply because they were better than nothing. India understood that manipulation works by narrowing your perception of options, by making you believe you have fewer choices than you truly do. The antidote was to expand those choices, to diversify alliances, and to invest in self-sufficiency so that no single partner could dictate the terms of progress. This awareness brought with it a different kind of confidence. India no longer approached the negotiation table as a junior partner, eager for validation. It arrived with the knowledge that partnership, if genuine, must withstand the light of full transparency. It must not crumble when terms are examined closely. It must not depend on one side remaining quiet about their concerns. By recognizing the manipulation behind the mask, India could finally decide which partnerships were worth keeping, which needed rebalancing, and which should be left behind entirely. And once the mask was removed, the conversations changed. There was no more pretending that every deal was a favor, no more assuming that friendship and fairness were always the same thing. Instead, there was clarity, a clarity that allowed India to see not just the terms of a trade, but the intentions that shaped it. Walking away from a trade deal is rarely just about the numbers. On the surface, it might look like a calculation of profit and loss, of import costs and export gains, but beneath that lies something deeper, a choice about identity, about standing, about the kind of nation you intend to be. For India, ending a major trade arrangement with America was not simply a shift in economic policy. It was the transformation of an exit into a declaration, a way of saying to the world, we will decide our own course, even if it cost us in the short term. For years, trade had been treated as the lifeline that tied economies together. The logic was simple. Interdependence reduces the likelihood of conflict and increases the chance of mutual prosperity. But that same interdependence, if imbalanced, becomes a chain rather than a bridge. When one side controls the flow of goods, the standards of quality, the timelines of delivery, and even the penalties for non-compliance, it is no longer a partnership. It is a structure of control. And breaking away from that control is rarely met with applause from those who benefit from it. India knew the risks. The decision to walk away was bound to trigger immediate consequences. Market reactions, diplomatic tension, and criticism from voices both inside and outside the country. But sovereignty has a price, and a nation that hesitates to pay it will find that price only grows steeper with time. The true question was not whether the exit would hurt, but whether continuing to stay would quietly erode the ability to make independent choices in the future. By framing the exit not as an act of retaliation, but as an act of principle, India shifted the narrative. It wasn't about punishing America, nor about rejecting global trade altogether. It was about rejecting terms that no longer reflected equality. It was about refusing to be bound by an agreement that favored one side under the cover of cooperation. And in that refusal, India wasn't just protecting its markets, it was protecting the right to decide how those markets would grow, what industries would be prioritized, and which partners would be trusted. The symbolism of the move was powerful. In international relations, perception matters almost as much as reality. Walking away signaled to the world that India's consent in trade was not automatic, that access to its markets was not a given, and that respect was not negotiable. This message traveled far beyond Washington. It reached every capital that had ever assumed India would choose stability over sovereignty, convenience over control. For the Indian people, the act resonated on a different level. It stirred a sense of ownership, a reminder that their nation was not afraid to stand on its own feet, even in the face of uncertainty. It challenged the narrative that growth could only come through compromise with more powerful economies. It rekindled the idea that prosperity earned without independence is a fragile prosperity, one that can be taken away the moment the terms shift. And in the days that followed, while some saw only the potential losses, others began to see the possibilities. Without the constraints of that agreement, new trade routes could be explored, new alliances forged, and domestic industries strengthened without external pressure dictating their pace or direction. The exit became not the end of a chapter, but the clearing of a path. Turning that moment into a statement of sovereignty required more than just leaving the table. It required leaving with the confidence to stand behind the decision, to absorb the short-term shock in pursuit of long-term freedom. It was a reminder that sovereignty is not something granted by others. It is something maintained by the willingness to say no, even when the world expects you to say yes. And that, more than any tariff or trade figure, is what the decision truly represented.